Welcome to Makes and Mends. I'm Miriam and I'm going to show you how I made a junk journal out of this recycled card and paper that I had hanging around the house. If you want to print out the instructions and checklist for the full list of resources, please go to my blog. The link is below in the description. As you can see, I made this junk journal out of all sorts of paper that I had hanging around, used envelopes, some packing paper that came in Amazon parcels, some scrap paper from the printer and pages from magazines. And it doesn't really matter what sort of paper you use, because ideally you will be covering everything up with beautiful embellishments and other pieces of journaling as you go along. The cover is a cereal box, and I just covered the card of the cereal box with some fabric. You do need a few things for this project, and I used a set square and a steel rule, a Stanley knife, an awl for the bookbinding, a pencil, and a Yoo-hoo stick. You can use any brand of glue, it doesn't really matter. Some duct tape or parcel tape, needle and thread. I like to use embroidery thread. Your remnant of fabric and a magnetic closure. I happen to reclaim this one from a handbag that I was throwing away, but you can buy them online in a variety of places or in craft shops. They're quite easily found now, and they come in those 4 parts with the washers as well as the actual closure itself. I also used a sewing machine, which is entirely optional. There are other ways around it. The paper for my signature, and of course my cereal box cardboard inside. This is a list of instructions that I used for the project. I like to have a list of instructions to follow when I'm making something. So you can use it from here, or you can print out the list from my blog. So as you can see, the first thing that we're going to do is measure the card. I'm using an old cereal box, and I've cut down one side so that it's really nice and flat. And I'm just checking through my signatures to make sure that the pages are as I want them. And then I'm not really going to do anything too precise. I'm just going to use the size of the signatures to work out how big I need the covers to be. I've got 2 cereal boxes here, and I'm just opening them up nice and flat and making sure that they fit together nicely, and I'm going to trim them to size. I like using cereal boxes because the folds in the spine are really easy to use as a measuring guide, as a sort of starting point. So I measure how wide I think I'm going to need the spine. Don't squish your signatures together too tightly when you're doing this measuring, because you want to leave quite a lot of expansion gap for each signature so that they have got space to take all of the embellishments that you're going to put in it. So I just wrote on there how wide I want to have it, and then I'm using my set square against the crease of the card to try and make sure that it's as straight and as flat as it's going to be. So now I'm just going to score down the line that I've drawn, and this is going to be one of the folds of the spine. So I'm scoring it down so that it folds nice and straight, and I don't have too many bubbles in the cardboard, and I'm just gently prising it back against the fold, against the score, to make the spine. So I'm just making the creases nice and crisp, making sure that it sits nice and squarely, and I'm going to check that my signatures fit in that spine comfortably, and it looks like they are. They're going to have space to expand once they've got all the embellishments on the pages. Now what I'm doing now is I'm just trying to make all the edges as square as they can be. When you've trimmed a cereal box down, all of the edges aren't precisely square, so I'm using one of the creases in the spine as a reference point and my set square just to make sure that all the edges are all squared up, so that when it fits together as a whole journal, the edges meet and the corners meet, and it doesn't look like it's all lopsided. Now that I'm happy with all those lines, I'm just going to go ahead and trim along them to make the cover the size that I want it to be. see that taking shape. It's the right height, and now I just need to start adjusting the length of the covers side to side so that they fit in. Now when you do this, it's easier to do the front half of the cover first, because the back half of the cover is going to have an extended piece on it to take the magnetic closure. So now that I finished adjusting that, you can see that the front cover now fits it very nicely. It's just the right width and just the right height. And I'm just using that as a guide to work out where I want the edge of the cover at the back to be. I haven't really measured it, I'm just sort of eyeballing it really. And that's okay to do because you're going to cover it in fabric anyway, and it will fit, so you don't need to worry. So now I'm going to measure this line. This is going to be the edge of the back cover, but we're not going to be trimming it off because we want to put our magnetic closure in. If you're not using a magnetic closure, you can just trim this off and have it like a regular journal that's just open, doesn't need to be closed. But if you're using a magnetic closure, you're going to want to bend this extension piece up so that the whole cover at the moment looks a little bit like a box. I'm just double checking the measurements really to check that the width of the back cover and the front cover are the same, and it's a little bit out, so I'm just going to trim it up so that they are the same. So that's all trimmed now, and the signatures fit in very nicely. I'm happy with all those sizes. I'm just double checking. And now I need to work out how I'm going to put the extension piece on that was going to go over the top of the front cover with the closure on it, and how to reinforce the front half of the cover as well, because we do have that additional crease which is part of the original creases of the box. So I'm using my other cereal box to make a sort of another cover that I'm going to stick together back to back. When you do this, you want to try and make sure that you stick the printed sides together, because if you're using, depending on what fabric you're using, if you're using a pale fabric or a particularly thin fabric, the print of the cereal box will show through. So you want to be able to stick the covers printed side to printed side, so you've got this plain side showing. So I'm doing this. The first half is going to be reinforcing of the front cover so that where the crease of the spine is isn't weakened. It's not going to be bending when it's a journal, it's going to be nice and sturdy. It's well worth taking your time to make sure that you measure this correctly, because you've got lots of creases going on in both pieces of cardboard, and only 2 of the creases are your actual spine. So do spend some time making sure that you get it right before you make any additional trimmings or before you glue it together, just so that you know that you've got it absolutely right and accurate. The purpose of all this measuring is I want to try and create 2 pieces of cardboard. One to stick to the front half of my cover from spine to the edge, and one for the back half of my cover from spine to the edge. And I've made it particularly difficult for myself by using signatures which are more narrow than the original edge of the box. You can make this far easier for yourself by using signatures which just allow you to use the creases in the box itself. So if you want a slimmer journal, just use a smaller box. I did make this particularly difficult for myself. So as you can see, I've now got 2 pieces, and I'm just trying to work out which bits I'm going to use to reinforce the front so that that crease doesn't keep bending when it's a front cover, and I'm labelling them so that I don't forget. So this is my front cover and this is my front cover, and I'm just labelling them so I know what to stick to what. This is going to be the piece that's going to be reinforced on the magnetic closure, and this is the bit that I'm going to use to do it. So what I'm trying to do is match up the creases that I have made for the edge of the journal with a crease that was already existing in the box, and that just makes it much easier. So I've drawn that line, I know where the edge is going to be, and I'm just going to score it so that it then fits over the top of the front cover. So in effect what you have is a journal cover that has two spines, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the right will open under the closure, and the one on the left will be where you bind your signatures. So all I'm doing now is I'm just tidying up this edge. This is where one of the original creases of the box was, and I don't want that on there because it will feel like a bump through the fabric. So I just want it to be nice and smooth. Now there is a bit of a gap between where the front cover is going to be, reinforced front cover is going to be, and where the reinforced back part of the cover is going to be. So I'm just using some more of the offcuts from my box to bridge that gap. So the whole of the inside cover will be covered in another layer of cardboard to make it nice and sturdy. There's an old adage that says measure twice, cut once, but in this case we're going to measure twice and glue once. So now that I'm happy with that part, I'm going to glue them together so that I don't keep getting muddled up. I'm using a Yoo-hoo glue, and I also decided to use some of this craft glue as well, just to make sure that it was super secure, I suppose. But you can use whatever glue you have. I'm not particularly loyal to any particular brand, I just use whatever glue I happen to have in. Now that I've glued that, I can get the third piece of reinforcement that I'm going to be using, because now that it's glued in, it's actually far easier for me to work out where I want to make particular cuts. I am just using it as an edge, so I'm making sure that that's nice and secure against one edge, and then I'm going to measure both the top and the bottom, and I'm measuring where the spine will be on that piece so that I can put the score lines in so that it will fold nicely with the rest of the cover. So that's all nicely trimmed up now. I'm checking that it's going to move accurately, and I'm just labelling that with the other pieces, so just to remind myself where I need to glue things. So I'm going to glue this piece on. That's going to go across the spine, print side to print side. Use a bit of craft glue, and I'm just going to make sure that that's stuck on there. Now it's really important when you're waiting for the glue to dry that you're holding it to dry in the position that it's going to be bended, because if you dry it completely flat, you might find that then when it dries and you try and bend across those score lines, that it doesn't want to move as one piece, and it might be very stiff and cause you a few problems. So I like to try and make sure that it glues down in the shape that I want it to be when it's dry. Once you're happy that that's as secure as it can be, I'm going to now just glue on the front, and I remembered which piece is the front because we labelled it, which is always very helpful. A bit more of the craft glue, and then you're going to see that that reinforced piece, I've made sure that the bit that I have stuck over the reinforcement doesn't have a crease in it, so it's not going to allow that original crease from the box to bend when that is part of my front cover. And that's what you need to make sure. If you glue a score line or a crease over a crease, it will still bend. If you want it to stay highly structured, then you need to make sure that you reinforce that crease with something else. What I'm just doing now is I've just pegged it together while it dries, and I've just used some little pegs which are actually quilting pegs. They're to use when you're quilting things together, but you could use clothes pegs or paper clips or bulldog clips, whatever you happen to have hanging around. It's just to give you another pair of hands, really. Now, because that crease has been scored and creased so many times, what I like to do is just reinforce it with a little piece of duct tape. You could use packing tape or sellotape. You're not going to be able to see it, so it doesn't really matter. You could even just paste some paper and glue over it. It's just to help keep it really structured, so every time you open and close the journal, it maintains its shape. Now I've trimmed off that edge and I'm happy with that, and I'm going to tick off on the list everything that I've done so far. So now comes the really lovely part. We're going to be able to encase that piece of cardboard in some pretty fabric so that it looks really lovely. And the first thing that you're going to do to prepare it is you just need to make sure that the fabric that you're using is really nicely pressed. It doesn't have any creases in it, and that's going to give you the best finish. So once your fabric is nicely pressed, all you're going to do is carry on using your iron and iron your fabric all along the edges of your cardboard, so that when you come to stitch it together or glue it together or whatever you choose to do, that crease has already been made. You're not going to be fighting the fabric. You're going to use your iron to train the fabric where you want it to go around the cardboard. When you're happy that you've done all that pressing, I just like to keep checking that the signatures fit nicely in and that the cover is going to bend and move the way that I want it to with the fabric on it. And this is particularly important because if you're using a specialist fabric or a particularly thick fabric, you might want to check that it still enables your cover to bend in the way that you want it to. I'm just finishing off the corners here in the same way that you would wrap a present, just folding them in about 45 degrees, and I'm making sure that they're nice and crisp. I'm just using a letter opener here to just make sure that those corners look really sharp, and when I'm happy with it, I just steam it back down. Even though there's cardboard in the middle, you can still use a little bit of steam, and while it's still hot, I just peg it on there, and then as the fabric cools, it keeps that crease so that you don't have to keep wondering where it is. I find that cotton is really a good fabric to use for this sort of project because you can use a high heat and you can use steam on it. If you are using a really specialist fabric, you might find that that's a little bit more tricky. So do test a little sample with your iron first, just to make sure that you don't go full steam ahead and just end up with a load of melted fabric on the bottom of your iron. It's probably not ideal. Now that we're happy with the way that our cover looks, we're going to set about putting the magnetic closure in. And one of the tricks that I like to use is to use a needle. So first of all, what I do is I measure the cover to make sure that I know where the middle is, and I just poke a needle in the middle so that I can keep an eye on it. It's the middle from top to bottom and also the middle of the closure flap. And I poke that needle all the way through both pieces, just using a steel rule here to finish off it so that it doesn't hurt my finger. And then I can take the clips off and open it up, and you'll see that that needle pokes through both sides. I'm just repegging down the fabric on the other edge to keep that in place, so that when I keep bending it upwards, I'm not moving the fabric, it's staying where it's supposed to be. I'm making a mark where I want the closure to be as well. So this is for the closure that's going to go on the front side, and this is the easier closure to put in. You don't need to worry about the fact that we will see the back of this, because we're going to be putting a lining onto our cover, so you're not going to see any of these edges or the back of this front closure either. So these washers that come with the magnetic closures are really useful because I like to use them as a guide. They've got two slots in them where the legs of the closure fit inside them, and also like a middle slot. So I just use a pen and mark it up. I'm using the needle guide, and the two slots either side where the legs go through, I'm just using my Stanley knife to make a hole all the way through all layers, through the fabric, through the cardboard, through the fabric at the back. It doesn't go all the way through necessarily, so you can just turn it over and put the holes in there that side as well. Once you've made your slits for the prongs of the closure, you can just slide them through. They might need a little bit of encouragement if you've got particularly stubborn fabric, but that's okay. And as soon as you've got them both through, you need to bend them to each side so that they don't come back out again. So put the washer on, and then you're going to be bending the prongs over the top of the washer. I use this steel rule because the metal is actually very strong and it will hurt your fingers if you try and do it by just using your fingers. You'll see that it's nicely in the middle, and I'm happy with that positioning. And now what I need to do is work out where I want the position of the closure on the inside. So before we put the closure on the inside, what we need to do is prepare the lining for the cover, because the inside closure is going to go through the lining so that you can't see the back. So in the same way as we did for the cover, we're going to start by ironing our fabric, and I've again made this job more difficult for myself than it needed to be because I've used a piece of fabric that is only just big enough. If you use a piece of fabric that's got a larger border, it will make it much easier for you. So just once again, use your iron to make sure that you are happy with the size of the lining. You want it to be almost the same size as the cover. You want it to come almost to the edge because you're going to be either gluing it or sewing it down. You don't want to leave too much of a border, and you don't want it to be so tall that you can see it when the journal is closed. So just keep using your iron until you are happy with being the right size. When you're happy with all of your ironing and that it's the right size, I just use the clips that are keeping the fabric onto the cover to clip the lining in place as well, so that I can check that it moves around how I want it to. You can see here how difficult I have made this task for myself. Because this fabric is only just wide enough, I've got very little to play with on this edge, so I'm just drawing a line down to make sure that I know where to make the fold, and then I'm going to iron it over this steel ruler so that I don't burn my fingers. But I'm sure that you've got a size of fabric which is far more sensible and you won't have this issue. When you're happy with your lining and it's all pegged in, you'll need to set about putting in the magnetic closure for the inside. Now this closure is going to go through the lining fabric and through the cardboard, but not through the fabric on the outside, so you won't be able to see it. It will all be completely concealed. So we already made a mark on the inside where we want the closure to be, and we did that when we put the closure on the outside. So I'm just going to use the needle again, put it all the way through so that I can measure where I need the holes to be on the inside lining. I'm going to put the washer that goes with the closure over the top of the needle and mark the places where I want to make the cuts, and then I'm just going to put a piece of cardboard underneath there, and then I'm going to make sure that that all fits nicely. It can be quite fiddly to do, so do take your time. Remember to measure twice and cut only once, because it would be a shame to have done all this work and then not put it in the right place. So I'm just going to use my scissors to snip through the cardboard, and then I'm going to unwrap this a bit like a parcel, and I'm just going to make a small mark so that I can see where I need to make the holes underneath it. Now I don't want to go through the fabric on the outside of the cover because I want this to be completely concealed. So I've just put my steel ruler underneath so that when I go all the way through the cardboard, it doesn't go through the fabric on the other side. Now I'm also making a sort of cardboard washer. So that when this all sits nicely, you can't see it through the fabric. Like a sort of interfacing, I suppose, but for the cardboard world. So I've put the closure through the lining fabric, through the cardboard, and I've put the washer on the other end, and now I'm just going to use the steel ruler to bend the prongs back. You can see that's all on the inside, very nice. And then I've got this sort of cardboard cover, and I'm just putting some glue on that, spreading it a really thin layer. You don't want to be too gluey because you don't want that to come through the lining, the cover fabric either. And I'm just gluing that over the top of the closure washer so that it doesn't show through the fabric on the cover side. You want it to be completely invisible. Now when you're happy that that's dry, you're going to need to fold the cover fabric back underneath, and because I've got quite a wide piece of fabric here, I'm just going to trim it down so that it fits round where the closure is. So I'm just going to tuck that all in. You won't be able to see any of the edges, and then as you can see, I'm going to peg that back down, and you won't be able to see it. You won't be able to see it on either side. Just double check. That's lovely. I'm putting the pegs around about where the bends are in the cardboard, and you can see now that that fits really quite nicely together. Now I've taken it away and I've stitched all the way around the edges on my sewing machine You could stitch it by hand, or you could just glue it down and leave it clipped together overnight until the glue is all dry. It doesn't really matter how you do it. Now your cover is all finished, the last job to do is to bind the signatures in. So if you already know how to do that, you can stop the video here. I'm just ticking off everything on my list that I've done, and I can see that I'm down to the last few stages. If you don't know how to bind the signatures in, then this could be useful for you, and there's lots of other YouTubers out there that can also provide videos for you on how to do all sorts of binding. I do a very simplified version, and the first thing that I do is I just double check all my signatures are in the right place. So if I'm using pages that aren't all the same height, I just make sure that they are in the places where I want them to be. I'm going to move this envelope around a little bit so you can't see the whole of it. And I'm going to make sure that any print pages are up the right way or the way that I want them. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clip them together so that the pages don't move around again. I do that for all of the signatures that I'm going to bind in, and I do it all in one go so that it's all done. When you're happy with all your signatures, you're ready to bind them in. So one of the things I do is I like to make a template, and I just get a piece of paper and I measure it to be the same height as the spine of my journal, and then I can use that to create some guidelines for where I need the holes to be. So I fold it in half as though it is part of my signatures, and then I do some more measuring and I work out where I want the holes to be. So I bind over 5 holes, 1 in the centre and 2 either side. I have seen journals bound with only 3. I suppose it depends how tall your journal is and how heavy your pages are or are going to be. I've actually made a mistake here, so I'm just going to start my template again. Now, this kind of just illustrates why I do a template. Imagine if you had already begun marking the fabric or making the holes and then realised that you'd made a mistake. So I'm starting all over again, measuring the distance of the holes that I'm going to use to bind my signatures in. So I've marked the top as well so that I always get the template around the right way, and I'm just going over the marks so that I know where to put the holes. So I'm making some holes against the marks in the templates. And now I've made them in the signatures, I'm also just transferring all of the marks and the holes onto my journal cover. And I like to make the holes up front rather than trying to use a needle to make them for the first time, because it just is too thick a cardboard and it's too thick a cover to be able to do that. You could do that with a thinner cardboard cover, or if you were just using a single folded cover, that would be fine to do. But with a cover like this, it's really useful to pre-make the holes. So now now that's all done, I'm going to thread up the needle. I'm using a red embroidery thread, sometimes called embroidery floss, but it's the sort of thread that you use for cross stitch. And I'm going in the centre hole and the corresponding hole in the cover, and then you can go up or down, it doesn't matter which, and oftentimes that will happen. You'll just put it far too far through and it will come out, so you just start again really. And this is just a really simple running stitch. You go in one hole and out the other, up and down, just matching the corresponding holes. And then you go back through the ones you've already used until you get back to the centre. The sort of running stitch or figure of 8 pattern. Now it's really important that when you go in the hole that already has a thread through it, you don't stitch through the thread. Embroidery thread is made up of 3 or 4 separate strands, so you need to make sure that you don't actually sew straight through the thread. And the reason you need to do that is because you will want to tighten up the threads before you tie it off in the knot, because you need to keep it a little bit slack to get the needle through the signature and then back through the cover. So it's really important that you make sure you go alongside the thread when you're going back on yourself and don't stitch through the thread, otherwise you won't be able to adjust the thread in order to get a better tension on the stitching. So now I've done all the stitching, what I'm doing is adjusting the tension. So I'm just pulling all the individual stitches through and making sure that they're as tight as I want them to be. And then I take the needle through one of the stitches and just tie it off in a simple knot so that it doesn't come back undone and snip the threads. What you then do is just repeat that process for the other 2 signatures. As you can see, I've already made another mistake in this binding and I'm going to have to unthread it in a minute. This is why it's so important that you don't bind through the thread, because it's made up of multiple strands, but when you pass the needle through each hole you make sure that you are passing the thread side by side, not through it. This makes it so much easier to unpick if you need to. Don't worry too much if you make a mistake with the binding, it is quite easy to unthread it, just take your time and it will be fine. Now that you have finished sewing in all of your signatures into the spine, you can have a look at your journal and admire it, see how lovely it is. I just give it a quick flick through to check that all my pages are bound in nice and securely and that they're all fastened in properly. And start imagining how you're going to use this beautiful book. This is such a lovely project because it's so nice to be able to use old rubbish that would ordinarily be thrown away and repurpose it into something that's really lovely and that you'll be able to keep. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that it's been useful to you and I really hope that you'll be able to join me in my next video. Bye!